Coming up on New Day at Arirang. Today marks 2 years since South Korea saw its first COVID-19 infections. 2 years have passed, but the nation is still expected to see new COVID-19 cases jump toward the 6,000 mark today. President Moon Jae-in is now in Egypt, the final leg of his week-long tour. There, Moon is set to hold a summit with his Egyptian counterpart and attend a business roundtable. And amid ongoing tensions over Ukraine, Moscow reiterated that it's not going to attack anyone. This comes as U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken promised to exert diplomatic efforts to prevent further aggression.
Hello and welcome to this Thursday edition of New Day at Arirang. It's 8 a.m. on January 20th here in Seoul, South Korea. Thank you ever so much for being with us. I'm Mark Broom.
And I'm Kim Mo-gan. Over the next hour, we'll take a look at the big news stories of the day and get expert insight on the issues facing Korea and the world.
We begin, though, with another uptick in the number of COVID-19 cases in South Korea, even with all the antivirus restrictions we currently have in place. New infections are expected to be close to 6,000 on Thursday and perhaps even 7,000 plus by the weekend. With Omicron spreading fast, health authorities are encouraging people who have yet to do so to get their booster shots.
For more, we have our COVID-19 correspondent, Kim Yeon-seung, here in the studio with us. Good morning, Yeon-seung.
Good morning.
So like always, let's start with the local transmissions here in South Korea. We're expected to see another rise, right?
Exactly. So Thursday's new cases are expected to top 6,000. Up until Wednesday, 9 p.m., health authorities logged 5,249 cases. That's a jump of 400 cases from Tuesday night and 1,700 cases higher than the same time last week. The numbers are rising quickly, but they're expected to push even higher. Health authorities are expecting infection tallies to top 7,000 sometime tomorrow or this weekend.
So 7,000 cases would be a very sharp rise in a relatively short period of time. Are there concerns that we could be seeing record amounts of daily cases before too long?
It is certainly possible. The latest peak that we've seen in the country was on December 15th, and that tally stood around 7,850. With Omicron taking over to be the dominant strain, authorities are fully expecting cases to get even closer to that number or even surpass it. They say that in 3 weeks, 80 to 90% of infections will be from the Omicron strain. Daegu City, which has been the epicenter of the virus back in early 2020, is once again witnessing high numbers. It found more than 360 cases of infection in their area up to 9 p.m. on Wednesday, and it's the highest seen since March 2020.
Right, so authorities have pinned Omicron as one of the main reasons of the latest surge. So, Yeon-seung, tell us more about how Omicron is spreading like wildfire in many regions here in South Korea.
Well, in Gwangju, for example, Omicron, around 80% of their local cases have been found to be Omicron. The area's kindergartens, nurseries, and childcare facilities are closing their doors for 2 weeks starting from next Monday in response to this latest surge in infections. In Jeollado provinces, Omicron makes up close to 60% of the cases and has replaced Delta as the dominant strain. In Gyeongsangbuk-do province, Omicron makes up around 37% of the cases, and in Gangwon-do, it's at around 31%. Omicron is also quickly closing in on the capital region. Pyeongtaek City in Gyeonggi-do province found 90% of their analyzed local case samples to be Omicron. The area ordered an administrative order for military personnel in the area's U.S. Army base to get PCR tested.
So I guess that begs the question, what can people do at an individual level in a bid to try and stem the spread?
Right, so vaccinations are most important. Authorities cannot stress enough the importance of getting the third shot. In fact, some of the groups that have a relatively low rate of third doses of vaccinations are also seeing a rise in cases. For example, infections among foreigners have been rising since late December, and they make up around 14% of recent cases, even though they're only 3 to 4% of the total population. a little over a quarter of the foreign population have received a booster shot, which is comparably lower than the share among the domestic population who's gotten their third shots. The government says that the COVID-19 jabs are the best defense that we have on hand against Omicron, so we recommend everyone to get vaccinated.
So, Yeon-sung, speaking of vaccinations, we heard that the government is planning to change some rules on vaccine passes. Tell us more on that.
Right. So before I go on, I would like to mention that providing more leeway to vaccine passes does not mean in any way that they're trying to water down the importance of vaccinations. In fact, vaccinations still remain relevant and important. That being said, authorities are doing this to tackle inconvenience and confusion. So vaccine pass exemptions have been extended to people who couldn't complete their regimen because they've shown an adverse reaction or were hospitalized after the first dose.
But then hasn't that always been the criteria for people to be exempt from these particular vaccine pass regulations?
Right, so I can see the confusion, Mark, but the change that we're making here now is that before, causality had to be proven. So there needed to be solid proof between the adverse reaction and the vaccine in order for people to be exempt from the vaccine pass. But there were a lot of complaints here and there because it's really difficult to prove any causal link between the two. Now the government accepts that a free pass is needed for people who showed a severe reaction or were hospitalized within 6 weeks of inoculation, even if they don't have a solid proof of a link to the vaccine. With this move, the free pass will be extended to roughly 12,000 to 17,000 people.
All right, Yeon-sung, thank you so much for the clear explanation. We'll talk to you again soon.
Yeah, thank you as always, Yeon-sung, for your comprehensive reporting on the situation here in South Korea. But in Great Britain, UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson announced Wednesday that mandatory face mask rules will be lifted in Great Britain from January 27th. That is next Monday.
And in addition, COVID-19 vaccine passports will no longer be required for large events and gatherings, and people can return to their offices. The easing comes as infection across many parts of the country have leveled off. Johnson told lawmakers that Omicron cases have, quote, peaked nationally. Today, January 20th, 2022, marks exactly 2 years since the first COVID-19 case was confirmed here in South Korea and transformed life as we used to know it. Tens of thousands have been infected and thousands of others have died since the virus arrived in the shores. And on top of that, face masks, hand sanitizers, QR code check-ins, and vaccine passes have become the new normal. Our Han Sung-woo has a timeline of how the pandemic has progressed here in South Korea.
January 20th, 2020, the day COVID-19 first entered South Korea. In the 2 years since then, over 700,000 people have been infected and roughly 6,500 have died. The nation's very first infection came from abroad, a Chinese woman who entered the country via Incheon International Airport. Not long after, the first wave of cases began in Gyeongsangbuk-do province and the city of Daegu, where a cluster infection at a religious cult led to hundreds of daily cases. Then, in the summer, the epicenter moved to Seoul and the surrounding area, fueled by clusters at a church in the capital and from public demonstrations in the heart of the city. That came before the virus spread nationwide in the winter months during the third wave, with daily tallies hitting the 4 digits as health authorities scrambled to contain the virus through strict social distancing guidelines. Vaccines finally started rolling out in late February, though, raising hopes that a gradual return to normal would soon be within reach by achieving the ultimate goal at that time, herd immunity.
It would mean that even the Delta variant can theoretically be overcome without masks, gathering bans, and business restrictions.
But little did health authorities know the worst was yet to come. Even with many vaccinated, infections spiked in July of last year as the Delta variant surged across the country, leaving hospitals in need of more beds, businesses struggling to survive, and schools unable to hold classes in person. High vaccination rates drove the government to initiate the shift to the so-called Living with COVID-19 scheme in November, but that abruptly came to a halt the next month as the Omicron variant emerged and cases soared to above 7,000.
We must break the chain of infections in the community and reduce the risk of contracting the virus.
With daily caseloads still lingering in the thousands, the highly transmissible mutation is expected to become the dominant strain in the country within this week, and authorities fear a fifth wave may be on the horizon.
The pandemic entered a new phase with the rise of Omicron. The scale is larger than ever. I call it Season 3. Humanity is longing for everything to end with Season 3, but if a new variant pops up, yet another season may be upon us.
Game-changing oral treatments, namely Pfizer's Paxlovid pill, are currently being prescribed though, something the nation is counting on, along with booster shots, to eventually bring all the chaos to an end.
In the end, it is the combination of natural immunity after infection and artificial immunity after inoculation that can boost the population's immunity to gradually contain the pandemic.
한성우, Arirang News.
Now, before we move on, just to clarify, I said that Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, is going to be lifting the mandatory face mask mandate from January 27th. That is, in fact, next Thursday, not next Monday. So just pointing that out for you. But now it's time to move on for On Point, which is a regular part in the show, where we speak to experts to delve deeper into the biggest news stories in the spotlight right now. As we just heard there, today, January 20th, 2022, is 2 years since the very first case of COVID-19 was confirmed in South Korea. It's an anniversary none of us particularly want to mark, but it is an anniversary nonetheless. COVID-19 cases in parts of Europe and the United States appear to be plateauing out, but in other regions the situation is actually getting much worse. Certain US states are reporting fewer hospitalizations and cases, but the picture is quite different in other states.
Parts of Europe are still reporting record levels of infections, and hardline restrictions put in place in countries like France, Germany, and the Netherlands have been met by large protests. In Asia, citing the current situation, the IOC now says only invited spectators who strictly abide by COVID-19 protocols will be allowed to attend the Beijing Winter Olympics. For more at where we stand globally in regards to the pandemic, we are joined by Ben Cowling, Chair Professor of Epidemiology at the University of Hong Kong. Good morning, Professor.
Good morning.
So, Professor, the government, how the governments vaccinate their citizens have become a heated debate. So the so-called vaccine passes have also been proven controversial, not only in Europe, but also here in South Korea. So what is your view on the need and the efficiency of these vaccine passes?
Well, in some places, there's a lot of enthusiasm among the population to get vaccinated, and that's great. In other places, maybe some people do want to get vaccinated, other people don't. And the government wants to find ways to get the vaccine coverage to a higher and higher level, because we know that's going to make the impact of COVID less and less, the higher the vaccine coverage is. So there's incentives, and there's also disincentives against vaccination or to get vaccinated. The World Health Organization has said that they think vaccine passports should be the last resort, the measure of last resort. Before going to passports, think about other ways to encourage people to choose to get vaccinated. Myself, personally, I'm not a big fan of vaccine passports, and I was glad to see that in Korea you're going to stop using them, you're going to phase them out. Israel did the same. They had them in place for a few months. They did the job, and then they took the passports away again. It seems like other parts of the world are going to keep them in place for much longer, and I'm not sure that's necessarily a good thing.
Yeah, we just heard the UK is thinking about doing away with the vaccine passes as well. It doesn't help when you have world leaders like President Macron in France saying he wants to make it incredibly hard for people to go about their regular life without these vaccine passes either. It just riles people up. But since this pandemic began, life has been turned upside down for all of us, but especially so for kids. Now, I know this isn't entirely your specialty, but you're still a professor in the medical field. Are you concerned with the face masks, the limited social interactions, the lack of playtime, all these kind of things, a mixture of it all is going to have a negative impact on not only the behavior, but also the cognitive and emotional development of kids? And it may not be something that appears right away, but something that happens in a few years' time.
No, of course I am. Actually, I'm not a particular expert on this, but my sister is a primary school teacher in Hong Kong, and she's told me that there's a lot of evidence of this happening in the children that are coming into primary schools now. They can't do things that children would normally be able to do at that age, whether it's writing their name or not needing a nappy if they're a bit younger, that kind of thing. So I'm sure that there's been a lot of impact. Now, of course, some of those measures were necessary for public health reasons because COVID is a major public health threat. But I think we're all looking forward to the days when COVID is much less of a threat and we won't need any of these public health measures anymore. And hopefully we can make up for the lost time, especially with the younger children.
And Professor, especially now that Omicron is known to be very more transmissible, there seems to be a notion that everyone would eventually catch Omicron, regardless of the preventative measures. What is now 3 years? It's going to be 3 years now. So, do you also sense this pandemic fatigue? And what would you say to people who feel that way?
Well, of course, there's a lot of pandemic fatigue. This is now the third year of the pandemic. I'm sure that you're going to get COVID at some point. I'm sure that I'll get COVID at some point. I'd rather it's later than sooner. It's going to happen sooner or later, but I'd rather that it's later. I think from the government's point of view, they know that people are going to get infected in the coming months, in the coming years, but they'd rather that each of us gets infected every 5 years or every 10 years or every 20 years rather than every year, because the more people get infected every year, that means the small proportion that get hospitalized is going to be a bigger number and cause more problem for the healthcare systems. So I think it's still important that we look for ways to protect ourselves. The government's still going to be on the lookout for ways to keep levels of infection relatively lower. But at the same time, I don't think we're going to see such drastic interventions in 2022 in Korea and in other parts of the world as we've seen earlier in the pandemic, because I think with vaccines, with antiviral drugs, as you mentioned, with the level of immunity that's been building up in the population, I think COVID poses less and less of a threat.
Now, finally, I wanted to touch upon something topical, because the IOC recently said that it's not going to be selling spectator tickets for the Beijing Winter Olympics to the public. They're only going to be for a very select number of people. A, do you think this is the right move? And also in regards to China, despite claiming they have a handle on this virus, they sure seem to be pretty anxious, pretty jittery. Do you think that the Chinese government are really covering up what is the real scale of the problem with this pandemic in China?
Well, of course, in mainland China, they're still following the zero COVID policy. That means they don't want any infections. If there's an outbreak in a city, recently we heard about Xi'an and then Tianjin and also a few other places. Whenever there's an outbreak, it's very, very disruptive for that city. They have to do a total lockdown, test everybody multiple times. I'm sure it has an enormous social and economic impact. So the less frequently they have to do this, the better. And in Beijing, I'm sure they're being very, very, very careful right now about the risk of Omicron. If it gets into Beijing, that would need a shutdown of the city, a lot of testing, and they want to minimize the chance that happens. So I understand why they've got this new policy of no visitors at the Olympics, no spectators at the Olympics, at least from the general public. I'm sure there will be people spectating. In terms of the scale of the problem, I think we can track the incidence of COVID in China, not only with the case numbers, but also with the lockdowns. We hear this particular city is having a lockdown and everybody's getting tested, that tells us already that there's going to be some cases in that city. And we can also check the daily case counts. So I don't think there's a lot of infections in China that we're unaware of, because they're so careful every time there's an outbreak to crack down on it really quickly.
All right, Professor Cowling, thank you so much for your insights as always.
Thank you.
Thank you. President Moon Jae-in is now in Egypt, the final leg of his week-long tour that also took him to the UAE and Saudi Arabia. During his three-day official visit, President Moon will hold a summit with his Egyptian counterpart and attend a business roundtable. Our senior Blue House correspondent Kim Min-ji, who has been traveling with the president, files this report from Cairo.
President Moon Jae-in arrived in Egypt Wednesday evening local time for a three-day working visit. On Thursday, he'll hold a summit with Egyptian President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi to discuss ways to bolster their comprehensive cooperative partnership. They are expected to seek ways to work together in future-oriented and sustainable areas, such as eco-friendly mobility, marine, and digital governance. Egypt has adopted Vision 2030, an initiative to achieve green growth and diversify its industries. Eyes will also be on whether they ink any defense deals, with Seoul and Cairo known to be in negotiations to export South Korea's K-9 Thunder self-propelled howitzers to Egypt. President Moon will also attend a business roundtable to discuss ways to bolster bilateral cooperation in future and green industries, like electric cars, IT, and transportation. South Korea is also seeking a free trade agreement with Egypt, which would be Seoul's first with an African nation. Bilateral trade amounted to $2.1 billion during the January to November period in 2021, up from $1.5 billion for the whole of 2020. Before arriving in Cairo, President Moon was in Saudi Arabia on a two-day official visit. On Tuesday, he met Nayef bin Falah al-Hashraf, the Secretary General of the Gulf Cooperation Council, to announce the resumption of free trade talks with the six-member Gulf Group. Comprised of Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Oman, Bahrain, Kuwait, and Qatar, the countries account for over 60% of South Korea's crude imports. If signed, the deal is expected to contribute to stabilizing supply chains and expand trade in products and services. President Moon also visited a construction site of the Riyadh Metro, a six-line subway system due to open this year. South Korea's Samsung C&T is one of the companies working on its construction. President Moon's trip to Egypt is the first in 16 years for a South Korean leader. Cairo is the final leg of his week-long tour to the Middle East and Africa. During Moon's visit, the top office hopes to expand the scope of bilateral cooperation and help pave the way for South Korean companies to enter Africa. Kim Min-ji, Arirang News, Cairo.
North Korea says it'll reconsider trust-building measures with the U.S., denouncing what it called Washington's hostile policy toward the regime. The announcement was made Wednesday at a Politburo meeting attended by Kim Jong-un. The state-run Korean Central News Agency reported on the meeting Thursday, saying the North is considering whether to resume all temporarily suspended activities, hinting it may restart nuclear and possibly ICBM tests. The report comes after a series of missile launches by North Korea over the past few weeks, including two tests of what the North says were hypersonic missiles. The U.S. is calling on China to fully implement UN Security Council sanctions against North Korea, but adds that it strongly supports humanitarian assistance for the North Korean people. Responding to a written inquiry from Seoul-based Yonhap News Agency regarding resumed trade between Pyongyang and Beijing, the U.S. State Department said it shares a view as China when it comes to improving the humanitarian situation in North Korea. However, it explained the North often diverts humanitarian aid away from its most vulnerable citizens.
As the flurry of diplomacy continues to prevent a feared Russian invasion of Ukraine, Moscow has reiterated its stance that it has no intention to take aggressive steps against its southern neighbor. This comes as the top diplomats of the U.S. and Russia will meet on Friday in Geneva to address the issue. Kim Hyo-sun has the story.
As tensions continue to simmer between Russia and the West over Ukraine, Moscow has again stressed it's not going to attack anyone. Speaking at a meeting of a Moscow-based think tank on Wednesday, Russia's deputy foreign minister stated that his country does not intend to take any aggressive steps. Russia's embassy in Washington also took to Twitter late Tuesday, urging the U.S. to, quote, end the hysteria, adding that Moscow has no military plans in regards to Ukraine. This coming as U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken promised to exert diplomatic efforts to stop any aggression.
We will continue our relentless diplomatic efforts to prevent renewed aggression and to promote dialogue and peace. At the same time, we continue to bolster Ukraine's ability to defend itself and make clear the costs that the United States and Europe will impose on Moscow if it rejects the diplomatic path that we've laid out and proceeds with an unwarranted, unprovoked, unacceptable invasion or destabilization of Ukraine.
His remarks came Wednesday after a meeting with his Ukrainian counterpart, who expressed support for Blinken's meeting with his Russian counterpart, Sergei Lavrov, in Geneva on Friday. Through that meeting, the White House says it plans to seek a diplomatic solution. Eyes are on the Blinken-Lavrov meeting as previous diplomatic engagement between the U.S. and Russia on Ukraine have failed to yield fruitful results. Kim Hye-san, Arirang News.
U.S. President Joe Biden is holding a formal press conference to mark his first year in office. In fact, it just ended. Now, on the eve of his one-year mark in office, Biden touted the work and efforts made by his administration. While acknowledging the frustration and fatigue from the pandemic, he said enormous progress had been made on COVID-19, reassuring the public that the country will not roll back to lockdowns. He also admitted that the U.S. should have done more testing earlier in the pandemic, but stressed that his administration is doing more now. Biden highlighted that the country is currently in a better position to tackle the virus, citing vaccination efforts and new medication. On inflation, he vowed to fight to keep it under control as people are seeing higher prices. 4 of South Korea's candidates running for the presidential election in March have laid out a single goal they all have in common, namely establishing an independent government agency in charge of managing overseas Korean affairs. There have been several attempts to do so in the past, but no substantial progress had been made. Our Lee Kyung-eun reports.
For 7.3 million South Koreans living overseas, dealing with government services is not as easy as in their home country. They have to use different ministries for different services. Passport issuance at the Foreign Affairs Ministry, entry and departures at the Justice Ministry, taxes at the National Tax Service. That's why they've called on the government to launch an Overseas Koreans Agency, where all of these services can be provided at once. It's also one of the major reasons why they'll be heading to polls to vote in the upcoming presidential election.
A lot of overseas Korean policies can change depending on who becomes the new president. With an overseas Korean agency as a key agenda, we sent each candidate a petition signed by some 4,000 people calling for its establishment.
Many overseas Koreans believe that the current Overseas Koreans Foundation run by the Foreign Affairs Ministry falls short in its capacity and that a more independent organization is needed. The World Korean Community Leaders Convention has delivered multiple resolutions calling for that to the Blue House and the National Assembly. Those efforts did help initiate related discussions. 9 bills have been submitted proposing either a ministry, an agency, or a presidential committee. Also, former President Park Geun-hye and the incumbent Moon Jae-in both proposed it in their pledges. However, no progress has been made so far.
Among bills on overseas Koreans, there was much attention on the need for establishing an agency. I ask your opinion on lack of progress and its need.
I believe it is the time when there needs to be a control tower, with related bills having been submitted by both rival parties. I anticipate something could be achieved in the next administration.
Their concerns seem to be reflected in the pledges made by candidates in this election. Democratic Party's Lee Jae-myung proposed an agency to provide comprehensive services. The People Power Party's Yoon Suk-yeol proposed merging the agency with the existing Overseas Koreans Foundation. Kim Sang-jung from the Justice Party also made a similar promise. And the People's Party's An Chol-soo vowed to launch a presidential committee first, then an agency. No details have been released by the candidates, but the first step will be changing the law to lay the legal foundations. But it remains to be seen whether whoever gets elected can finally make an actual push for that. Lee Kyung-eun, Arirang News.
Now it's time for us to cross over to our Ocean for global insight and an in-depth look at important developments in world affairs.
Thanks very much, Mark. It is indeed time for Global Insight. Now, Thursday marks 1 year since the Joe Biden administration took office after what was arguably the most chaotic presidential transition in history. Before he stepped into the White House, what's seen as the beacon of world democracy, Capitol Hill, was stormed by a massive violent riot stirred by former President Donald Trump to contest the outcome of the 2020 election. It was a politically divided America, not to mention a pandemic-stricken economy with millions of Americans in need of stimulus checks. So from day one on January 20th, the new president hit the ground running, promising to build back a better America. So today we take a look at Mr. Biden's domestic, social and economic policies with Mark Shanahan, Associate Professor in Politics and International Relations at the University of Reading, and Professor Neil Mahoney, Professor of Economics at Stanford University and co-editor of American Economic Journal, Applied Economics. A very warm welcome to you both. Thank you for joining us today. And, well, let's begin with you, Professor Shanahan. Now, it's been a year since Mr. Biden took office, and, well, according to 538, his approval ratings have been pretty dismal in recent days, with 52.2% of Americans disapproving of his policies. Now, while his approval ratings are slightly higher than those of his predecessor, President Trump, in his first year, why has Mr. Biden failed to appeal to many of these Americans?
It's very much a case, well, his opponents would say that he overpromised and underdelivered. He's actually spent the last few hours giving a very stout defense of what he has done and what he has achieved in his first year. And let's not forget that he came in at the worst time in the pandemic, and that everything that he has attempted to do has had the pandemic in the background. You worry in Korea about having 7,000 cases a day. America is still reporting well over 1 million cases on quite a few days, running at over 700,000 as an average. Biden has had to face this all the way through. He has actually got his COVID recovery bill in place. He's got a massive infrastructure bill through. But he's had a difficult time just dealing with his own party and with a very entrenched Republican Party that is just set out its stall to oppose everything he tries to do and everything he suggests. And don't forget, a president in the American system has limited powers. He needs the legislature on his side. He has wafer-thin majorities. He really needs the judiciary on his side as well. And while he has put a lot of judges on benches in the last year, he's faced a Supreme Court that is very conservative and not helpful in getting his major policies through either.
And now, Professor Mahoney, well, Mr. Biden's approval ratings might not be on his side at the moment, but US financial markets say they've been outperforming the world by the biggest margin in the 21st century, according to Bloomberg, which also noted that the Biden administration achieved the highest GDP growth among any incoming government during the last 4 decades. So what's led to these very strong economic figures?
Yeah, so, the U.S. economy and the stock market, which are separate things, have been performing well. And if you look at the last 20 years, I think it's a story of tech. All of the leading tech firms, or many of the leading tech firms in the world, have gone from 0 to 60 in Silicon Valley, where I live, over the last 20 years. Over a shorter time horizon, I think we've seen that the pandemic, while on average may be bad for the economy, has been good for tech, and the U.S. has had a very robust set of economic stimulus, which has kept demand for goods in particular quite high. So that has been good for the firms like Amazon that provide those goods.
And Professor Shanahan, although the economy is doing rather well, it seems that there is still very much a strong partisan divide in American society. Why has it been so tough to bridge this gap for Mr. Biden?
Again, I'd go back to the point of perhaps over-promising. So Joe Biden came in and said that his number one goal was to unite the country. That is really, really hard after 4 years of Trump and of misinformation and of a former president who really looms large over society still, who is talking about a steal, who is saying that he didn't lose the election, who is still fomenting the political stories every day with tales of how Joe Biden shouldn't be in office at all. Trump still has a strong support. It's not as strong as it was in 2016 at all, but there are still many, many millions of people. There are still chunks of the media who won't believe that Biden is the legitimate president. So it's a hard fight. But he also has a hard fight in his own party. He has a broad tent party that goes from a progressive wing that would really like him to be more left and more radical, to the centrists who are actually far closer to the Republicans than most of the Democrat Party. He has to constantly try and balance the needs of both sides. The independents who he needs to vote for him and to vote for Democrats next time round, and to keep them all on side. And it is an incredibly difficult juggling act. Stick the pandemic in the background, stick rising cost of living, high inflation, which is really a supply side issue. And it's made it very, very hard for him to really make that cut through and keep people on side. He says he's going to do things differently over the next year or so. We'll have to wait and see how big that difference is.
And Professor Shanahan, in recent days, President Biden's been trying to push through this new Voting Rights Act through the Senate. But, well, for our viewers who may not be so familiar with America's legislative system, what is the new Voting Rights Bill all about? And why do most Republicans and some Democrats oppose it?
So we had the huge voting rights legislation from the 1960s that enfranchised the whole of the country, really, that brought minorities into voting. And right the way through to 2011, that was largely untouched, although states tried to tinker with it. Then parts of that act were struck down by the Supreme Court. You have the separation of powers in America, and the judiciary has a strong and powerful influence. It enabled states, who are the fourth player in government, to make their own laws around voting, to make it harder for people who weren't of the party who ran the state, and it's normally Republican states, trying to make it more difficult for likely Democrat voters to vote. And many states enacted legislation that particularly would likely disenfranchise minorities. So with two pieces of legislation coming together, one of them under the Democrat great Congressman John Lewis's name, the legislature, the Democrats who run the legislature just about at the moment, were trying to redress what they see as an unfairness that has crept into the system, to try and bring federal scrutiny, particularly, into all of these state laws where they feel that people might be disenfranchised. This has really got to Republicans who think it is overreach from the legislature, affecting matters that should be dealt with at state level. States run elections. And even those Democrats who are blues in red states, so Democrats elected in what are largely Republican states, are finding it very, very difficult to support what the president wants and what the majority of Democrats in the Senate would like to achieve.
So, Professor Mahoney, while there's much attention on trying to get this new voting rights bill passed, the Democrats were also trying to revive the Build Back Better plan over the past year, which aims to expand domestic spending on welfare and propping up the economy. So how critical is the plan to the recovery of the US economy? And do you think the plan should be revitalized?
So the Build Back Better plan, at least envisioned this fall, was really about investing, I think, in the future of America, investing in children, reducing poverty. It was investments to reduce the impact of climate change, tax cuts. What the Democrats have learned is that the only path forward is a much skinnier Build Back Better bill, and so they're going to have to make hard choices. That they're not going to be able to sort of have everybody's item on the wish list. I think probably the most important priority here is the investments to combat climate change. That 30 years from now, we don't want to look back and say we missed the window of opportunity. So hoping that there will be a coalition that can push that forward.
And Professor Mahoney, it seems that the Biden administration also has to deal with this surging inflation that's, it looks like it's been out of control for the past year. And, well, the Fed seems to have given up on insisting that it's a transitory phenomenon. Well, why is it so hard to get price levels under control?
That's right. So inflation, came in at 7%, sort of year on year, relatively recently. And that's much higher than I think even the most pessimistic people were projecting 9 months ago. And it's due to a number of factors, some of them being unanticipated supply chain issues. Moving forward, I think most people have drawn confidence from the Fed statements about how they are going to, I think, aggressively raise interest rates if needed to combat inflation, that the bond markets, I think, are predicting that inflation will subside as supply chain issues get resolved. Exactly how fast this happens, I think, depends upon lots of factors, including factors that can't or are difficult to predict. But I think there is growing confidence that these issues will be tackled over the medium to long run.
And Professor Shanahan, well, looking ahead, what do you see as the biggest challenges for President Biden over the next 3 years? Do you think, for instance, West Virginia Senator Joe Manchin is going to like anything that he tries to do?
For Joe Manchin, probably only if he does something with big coal that is aimed particularly at West Virginia. So he'll probably spend the next 3 years going round Joe Manchin. But I'd pick up on three things. One, keeping his party together. Whether Manchin, Sinema are in or out on that. He has this broad tent. It is very difficult. Secondly, he has to hold on to independent voters. They're not best pleased at the moment. It's hitting people in the wallet. They're seeing gas prices flying, all of the things that tend to affect voters, particularly going into a midterm year where they really do like to kick the government if they can. He's got to keep those on board, because if he loses the House and the Senate, then he won't get any of his plans through. And thirdly, he's got to be able to reach across the aisle. If he can't keep his own party wholly united, he needs to pick off the Mitt Romneys and the one or two Republicans who will speak to Democrats and are also not cowed by the spectre of Donald Trump. It's going to be a very, very difficult 2022 for Biden. He said he wants to get out on the road. He wants to be talking to people a lot more. That's where he does well. If he gets through the midterms reasonably well unscathed, then it's about what's the agenda for 24. Will he run again? If not him, who is his anointed successor? Who's going to win those primaries for the Democrats? But this is going to be the trickiest year of his presidency.
And well, Professor Mahoney, what do you think is going to be the biggest challenge for the American economy this year?
Yeah, so on the economic side, I'm going to be paying close attention to three things. I think the first thing, if we've learned anything over the last 2 years, it's that it's dangerous to declare premature victory against COVID. So I think there may still be bumps in the road. Hopefully not another variant, but I think we still need to be building infrastructure so that we're prepared with whatever the virus throws at us. Two other things, I'm worried about sort of the zero COVID policy in China leading to continued supply chain issues. And so, hopefully those issues become resolved. But if China continues to shut down whole cities whenever there's a small number of cases, I think that is not going to be good for the U.S. economy and the global economy. And the third thing, sort of connecting to something else you talked about on your program, is tensions between the Ukraine and Russia. I think if those boil over into conflict, I think that could create serious headwinds for the U.S. economy.
Well, this is where we'll have to end the interview today, I'm afraid, as we're out of time. That was Mark Shanahan, Associate Professor in Politics and International Relations at the University of Reading, and Professor Neil Mahoney, Professor of Economics at Stanford University. Thank you both so much for your insights today.
Thank you.
Let's take a look at what's going on in the world now. According to the UAE ambassador to the United States on Wednesday, Yemen's Houthi rebels in their attack on Abu Dhabi earlier this week used cruise and ballistic missiles in addition to drones. These statements by Ambassador Youssef Al-Attaba marked the official acknowledgement that missiles and not just drones were used in Monday's attack that killed 3 people and started fires at a fuel depot. He added that while several missiles were intercepted, a few of them weren't, resulting in the deaths of 3 civilians. However, the envoy did not respond to further questions about how many missiles targeted the UAE and how many of them were intercepted. The Houthis said earlier that they fired 5 ballistic missiles and used a number of explosive-laden drones in their attack, adding they targeted the airports of Abu Dhabi and Dubai. However, there was no indication Dubai was hit in Monday's attack. Al-Attaba says the UAE is pressing Washington to designate the Houthis as a terrorist organization. Satellite remote sensing images of Tonga after last weekend's massive undersea volcanic eruptions show the island has been left in ruins and has completely changed the color of the ground surface in the capital city.
We can see from the satellite remote sensing images that there has been very obvious change in the color of the ground surface in the capital city of Tonga.
Comparing images of the same area captured in August 2020, it showed that volcanic ash from the eruptions changed the ground surface color from green to gray. Another satellite image showed the Hunga Tonga Hunga Ha'apai island was seriously damaged by the violent eruptions, while a third group of images showed that the eruptions left large amounts of red remnants in nearby waters. However, eruptions did not change the main layout of the capital city. The 2022 Qatar World Cup has opened applications for fans that want to secure their tickets to one of the biggest sporting events in the world. The opening ticket application phase began Wednesday, with tickets and packages set to be sold until February 8th. Most notable are the reduced prices, with residents and migrant workers able to attend games for just $11. For others, individual match tickets are sold for as little as $69, with tickets for the final costing up to $1,607. Event organizers have not yet announced how many fans will be allowed into the stadiums for the tournament, which runs from November 21st to December 18th. Lee Seung-jae, Arirang News.
Good morning. We are already down to the last winter term, 대한 meaning big freeze. And surely most of Korea is having a biting cold start to the day again, with a cold wave advisory remains in place across the nation. Also, yesterday's snow helped to ease the dryness in the capital, but Gyeongsangdo provinces and surrounding regions, including Busan and Daegu, are still under dry alerts. The snow has mostly let up. Seoul received more than 3 centimeters of snowfall yesterday, and east of Gangwon province and Ulleungdo and Dokdo will receive more snow through the morning, so please be extra careful out on the roads. Mostly sunny skies will be featured except in those snow-affected regions, and it is a freezing start to the day. Chuncheon at minus 14 degrees Celsius. Even Busan is waking up to a low of minus 3 degrees. Highs in Seoul will go up to positive numbers this afternoon, topping out at 2 degrees. Daegu and Jeju will go up to 5 degrees Celsius this afternoon. And we could really notice some relief from the cold from tomorrow afternoon. Then it's going to stay warmer than norms for a while. With that, here's a look at the weather conditions around the world.
And that's all we have for now. Mark and I will be back at 8 a.m. Korea time on Friday for our next edition of New Day at Arirang. I'm Kim Mo-gyan.
And I'm Mark Bream. Thank you, as always, for joining us. Until next time, goodbye.
Everyone knows I'm passionate. Know why? Look at how passionate Koreans are. And you know I'm fast. Don't blink. Koreans move fast too. I'm creative on the pitch. People say I'm smart.